It's time for the Rose Chat Podcast, a podcast dedicated to celebrating the world's most beloved flower, the rose. Join award-winning gardeners Chris VanCleave and Teresa Byington as they chat with rose lovers and experts from around the globe. With each episode, you'll gain valuable knowledge and insights to achieve the rose garden you've always dreamed of. Listen now as we explore the world of roses.
Hey friends, on today's episode, Leon Ginenthal is back to share with us the science behind soil. Now, I grow in Indiana clay, so I'm always excited to learn more on this subject. Hey Leon, welcome to Rose Chat.
I'm glad to be here again. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, but I'm trying to think spring, Leon, and the weather is not cooperating. How is it up there in upstate New York?
Bitter cold. We're having a winter like we did many years ago.
Yeah.
The past few years, it's been a walk in the park. So this year, I didn't put the snowplow on my lawn tractor. I thought I would just use the snowblower. Well, we haven't seen the ground in a long time here.
Well, that gets hard. I like to get out every day. I want to get out in the garden and just kind of look around, even if it's super cold. But we've had snow, we've had ice. Last night we were supposed to get a dusting. We woke up to 4 inches. So it's different here. It hasn't been like this for a long time here either.
Well, we'll get to see how well my cold hardy roses do.
I'm thinking the same thing. So, while we're waiting on spring, I think you've picked a great subject to get us better ready for the garden season. So, start us out with the basics.
Okay. First off, one thing I always ask everybody when they come to my nursery is, have you had your soil tested? And even veteran gardeners often have not done that. That's going to be the key thing I want everybody to remember and do. So let's start first off with the physical structure of soil. When you take a look at it, what is the physical structure? And physical structure is the arrangement of these particles into aggregates or larger pieces. And it's also the pore spaces in between. When thinking of soil, we often just think about the soil, but it's the air in between the spaces that's just as important. Now, you mentioned you have clay soil. What are your concerns with that?
Well, it doesn't drain, and it's clay to the cement side of clay. Now, our top layer is good. We're down, you can go down, you can plant a small rose or, medium-sized bush before you're going to get into the clay because we've amended it through the years. But when you get down to that base layer, it's concrete. I mean, it doesn't drain that well. So we've had to amend.
Gotcha. Well, that's because the clay soils have the smallest size particles. And along with the small size particle, there's very little space between the particles. So if you picture, well, let's take a look at 4 different types of soils. And I'd like you to picture bowling balls in a garbage can, large particles and big spaces between. And then we could think about baseballs, smaller particle, smaller pore size, but still, you could see the space between. And then we could go down to ping pong balls. And when we talk about clay soils, we're talking about ball bearings. Not much space in between it all. And the trouble with that is that the roots aren't able to get enough oxygen. There's not any space for it in the soil. And we tend to think about plants as breathing only through their leaves. They also breathe through their roots. Now, the advantage to clay soil, though, is that it's often mineral rich, so it's not a bad thing.
Well, that's good, but I can tell you if that's all you have, and I always think of it as big, and now you're telling me it's small, and I know that, but in my head it doesn't seem that way. But you can actually, when I've had to repot something or, take something up and replant it, it gets so far, and then you can just see where the struggle begins if it hasn't been amended.
Gotcha. So the roots aren't getting out into the native soil from the hole.
Strong ones do, of course, but there just are times when you see stunted growth, and especially if we're trying something in a new area that hasn't been amended.
Okay, well, remind me about that towards the end when we talk about planting, because I've got some strategies for that, other than just digging gigundous holes. So the next soil particle we'd be talking about would be silt soils. And they're larger than clay. They've got lots of nutrients. They hold moisture. And the nutrients and the moisture, interestingly enough, are not held in the particle. They're always held in the space in between. Now, the next size up would be sand. And sand has the largest size particles. Because of that, they drain really quickly, but they don't hold any moisture, so they dry out quickly. Now, the best thing they say to have is loam. And loam is a combination of all three. So we've got the advantages of the mineral-rich clay. We've got the advantage of the better drainage with the sand. And with the silt, we have good nutrient retention and moisture retention. So once we know we've got 4 types, and there's sandy loams, clay loams, combinations like that, we need to know, how can we figure that out? And is there a quick and easy way? When you hold your clay soil in your hand and you squeeze it, how does it look?
Well, some of it looks like modeling clay.
Gotcha. So it actually holds together and makes a tight ball, right?
It sure does.
Now, if you had a sandy soil and you did that and you opened your hand, it would just collapse. And the silt and the loam would be intermediate between those two. So we can tell right off the bat just by doing a squeeze test. The other thing that is a dead giveaway for a clay soil is you take some of that soil and you hold it between your thumb and your index finger, and you rub the two back and forth, and you try and make a ribbon out of that, a wide ribbon. And with a clay soil, you will make a fairly long ribbon because those particles actually hold together. Now, in terms of figuring out percentages and all, because most soils are not just one thing, what I like to do is have somebody do the mason jar test or the mayonnaise jar test. And with that, you're going to fill a mason jar about a quarter full of soil. Now, don't take it just from the very top, because with our mulch, you're not going to be getting what's really down where the roots are. But you're going to add water to that jar until it's 3/4 full. And then here's the magic ingredient: a teaspoon of powdered non-foaming dishwasher detergent. What that does is it's going to allow the particles to separate out by size. And you're going to shake that jar for about 10 or 15 minutes. And you're going to put it away and let it sit for a couple days. What you'll see is if you have any sand in your soil, it'll be at the bottom. The next layer will be silt, and clay will be on top. And to figure the percentages of each, you just measure the height of each layer and then calculate. Pretty straightforward. And that'll give you a really clear breakdown in terms of what your soil is made up of.
What a great tip. And that would be so wonderful to do with children as well.
They love the shaking of the jar. So, if you've got grandchildren around and you need to give them something to do, they'd be really into it.
Yeah, that's cool. Cool.
So the next thing I like to talk about is the chemical structure. And with the chemical structure, that has to do with things like what are the chemical elements, the different nutrients, whether they're macro, the big ones, or micro, the ones we only need little bits of, the pH of the soil, and something called the CEC. That means cation exchange capacity. And with that, we're taking a look at the ability of a soil to interact with other things in the soil, the different nutrients. And it's something that's not talked a lot about. Anyway, in terms of the major elements in the soil, we need to know what's in there because that's going to let us know if we need anything and if we need to modify, how to modify it. And the major elements are oxygen. Well, you think, that's taking up all that space in between, the pore space, right? Silicon, which is the sand. And then interestingly enough, it's aluminum and iron. So those are the big four. And then when we get to the macronutrients, these are the things that fertilizers tend to be made of. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But it's also calcium and magnesium and sulfur. These are also really important to have in the soil. So those are the big building blocks. And then we need just a hint of things like boron and copper and manganese and zinc. And sometimes what happens is our soils are, they're used up and there's not enough of micro or even macronutrients. What I found is that rose gardeners often, and most gardeners in general, will just use something like 10-10-10 or 20-20-20, and they'll apply it regularly. Well, that's like going in your medicine cabinet and taking out all these different antibiotics and all these different supplements and just taking them willy-nilly whether you need them or not. With a soil test, you'll find out what it is you actually need. When I was working with the Syracuse Rose Society at the Mills Garden, which just turned 100 years old last year, so that soil's been used a lot, they had been doing 10-10-10 or 20-20-20 for as long as the garden was around. And finally, last year, I got them to start soil testing. Lo and behold, they found there wasn't enough nitrogen in the soil, but there was too much phosphorus. And the more they kept fertilizing, the more they kept adding the phosphorus. And it's the proportions between these things that's just as important too.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
So we started to change what we did. We were adding specific fertilizers that were high in nitrogen. And then the next thing I had them do was check the pH of the soil, whether it was acid or basic. Now, roses they're kind of like Goldilocks. A lot of plants are, I guess. And they like it between 5.5 and 6.5, which is mildly acid. Well, we went and did a pH test, and it was 8.0, alkaline.
Oh my goodness.
Well, what happens is when you have an alkaline soil, even if you had enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the plant can't absorb it. It can only absorb it within the right range. So then we had to amend the soil in terms of pH. And that's not a one-shot deal. Folks think, oh, I did that in the spring. You've got to do it every 4 to 6 weeks through the growing season because you can't permanently change the pH of a soil. Now, in terms of how to change it, this is where the micro and macronutrients come in handy. If you look at most of these soil acidifiers, they have the word sulfur in it. But before sulfur, there's options of iron sulfur, manganese sulfur, magnesium sulfur, calcium sulfur. So you have to take a look at the soil test to see what is it you're deficient in those micro or macronutrients to go with the sulfur to acidify it. So that's, a quick way to start addressing things. Find out what's in the soil, find out what your pH is, and start amending to deal with that. Now, some roses are a little more tolerant than others. Rugosa roses hate alkaline soil, and the leaves will turn yellow and eventually they'll die. There are other roses that are more tolerant of it, but not many. Now, I also talked about that cation exchange capacity. What happens is that we have molecules that are formed that have an ionic charge, a positive or a negative charge. That means they're looking to hook up with another molecule to fill up the electrons in their orbit. And in order to do that, they need to find the calcium or magnesium or potassium that will complete that molecule. And those have those ionic bonds that will help them link up. And they're essential for nutrition.
The first
So
time
that
I remember seeing CEC was actually in 2020. I had plenty of time to think about the garden, and I had a comprehensive soil test done, and that was a part of that soil test. That's the first time I remember seeing that.
Yeah, a lot of folks see that. They have no idea what it is and how important it is. It's as important as pH. And we're going to get to how you can improve your CEC as the talk goes on. So far, so good?
So far, so good. I've learned a lot.
Great. Now, the next part is the part that gardeners almost never talk about, and you rarely even see it in the soil analysis. And that has to do with the biological soil health. We've spoken about physical structure, chemical components, but the really important part is the biology. Soil is a living thing, and it's the capacity of the soil to function as an ecosystem unto itself that allows us to really grow things well. If we think about a teaspoon of soil and we wonder, like, well, how much living matter is in there? Well, it's pretty amazing. In a teaspoon of soil, healthy soil, there are about 1 billion bacterial cells. There are thousands of protozoas. There could be 12 or 24 nematodes. Now, folks hear the word nematode and they think they're trouble. Well, there's good ones too. And then there could be up to 100 or 200 yards of the hyphae of fungus. That's those little hairs that come out. So there's lots and lots of living creatures that are in our soil. And if all we're doing is dosing with chemical fertilizers over time, we're going to be killing off that living component. And it's the living component that works in conjunction with the roots, the tips of the roots, to allow the roots to access the fertilizer and the moisture as well. So how do we encourage the biological component? How do we improve the physical structure? How can we adapt the chemical structure? Because we know chemical fertilizers by themselves won't do it. And that's where we come to organic matter. Do you add organic matter in your garden?
I sure do. I sure do.
And how do you do that?
Well, we buy compost and we
Hmm.
mulch and we use fertilizers that have more organic properties to them. So, do you
That
have
sounds great.
do you have recommendations?
Sure. One thing, I've started when I was gardening when I was 10 years old at one of my father's cousins' properties. He rototilled up a garden for us, and he was big in organic gardening even then. We're talking about the mid 60s. So I've been organic gardening now for probably about 60 years. And I thought compost was the be all and end all, and you couldn't have enough of it. Well, what soil scientists are finding out now is that we could have too much of a good thing. When you have a soil analysis done, they will also tell you what percent of your soil is organic matter. And that's why it's important not to take it from the top, but get down in the root zone. Any guesses in terms of how much organic matter we should have in soil? This is
Well,
I shouldn't do that to you.
I'm looking at organic matter on my little list here that I'm following, and it says 10.6. What does that say?
Well, that says that you've been amending your soil, but that's beyond the range at which it's actually good, believe it or not.
Ooh, tell me more.
So what they're finding is about 5% is a good amount of organic matter to have in your soil. Now, that doesn't mean you can't put the organic matter on top. So what happens is we've got different kinds of organic matter. So what we've got, the first kind would be what you mulch with. That would be like plant residues or living biomass like compost. It's alive. And then we've got what's called active soil organic mass. And that's would make up about the 5% that you would want in your soil. That's going to help break up the soil, those clay particles. It's going to help keep a sandy soil moist enough. It's going to help break down and release the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then the third type is stable organic matter. This doesn't have a lot of influence on fertility, but it's going to help the soil structure. And this you're also going to find in your soil, but no more than 5% or so. There can be too much of a good thing. So this organic matter, if you have it on top, there's more oxygen there. And if you think about a forest or a field, in a forest, we end up with this buildup of duff, the organic matter that sits on top, the soil layer, gradually breaking down. And if we think about a field in the fall and winter, the green matter on top dies and it starts rotting. It belongs at that top area. And what happens oftentimes is when we start digging deep down, trying to improve the soil, we're putting the organic matter down below the surface where it's not getting enough oxygen to break down. And we're taking that part that doesn't have organic matter and putting it up on top, which is going to create a hard crust and actually prevent water and nutrients from getting into the soil. So what we want to do is mulch that will allow the water to trickle through without washing away the soil. That will be the live zone, and the interface between your mulch and the soil is where there's going to be tons of microorganisms that are going to be breaking down that material and making nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, and the other micronutrients available for the roots. So the soil can hold more water. The roots can access the food. And also, that's going to increase that cation exchange capacity. So you don't have to do outrageous things, but mulch with plant residue, something that has a live biologic component like a compost, and you keep that on the surface, and the organisms in the soil, including the worms as well, and the rain, will move what's in that organic matter into your soil down to your roots where you need it.
Leon, what do you think about shredded leaves?
Shredded leaves work fairly well. The one thing to be careful of is that they don't compact too much. There was a year I was gathering leaves. I was driving through downtown, and people put bags out.
Mm-hmm.
So I got all these bags of leaves, and I ran my lawnmower over them, and I mulched my garden with them in the fall. Well, they made this almost impenetrable layer because all the particles were smaller and the same size, so they compacted. So I like, when I'm mulching, to have something with a wide range of particle size. And that's where things like wood chips work really well, because when wood is put through the chipper, you get some tiny little sawdust pieces and all the way up to big chunks.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows stuff to go through. So if you have leaf mulch, shredded leaves, mixing that in with wood chips and some manure, that would be fine.
That's such a good idea. And I love so much what you said, following nature. When we look in the woods and we see the fallen leaves and the different things that are happening, it's happening on top of the ground. So good.
One thing that I'm finding is, and I don't know if they're out your way yet, but the jumping worms,
We don't have
it,
them yet. So far, so
uh,
good.
well, we've got them around here now. They've come in with plant material from big box stores or large nurseries. And what happens is these worms are extremely active and voracious, and they'll be in the upper layer, and they will just eat everything. I've been mulching here for years, and mulch that used to last 2 to 3 years is gone in less than a season now.
Wow.
So it's something to keep your eye out on.
We will. We will. My goodness. This sound of it sounds so creepy to me. I know earthworms are our friends, but jumping worms, it just, yeah,
Yeah.
that's another
And
level.
what the jumping worms will outcompete the other earthworms. So the other earthworms will end up dying.
So where did these little rascals come from?
They were from Asia originally, but the worms that we have are not even native either. The ones that were here before that we counted on all the time, they came over with the colonists. If you're in the northern half of the United States, all of our native worms died out during the Ice Age. Around here in Ithaca, there were glaciers a mile thick sitting on top. There were no worms that survived those thousands of years. So the earthworms ended up coming over with the colonists when they were bringing plants. And those worms colonized and created a new system. Now you get in the southern U.S. and there's native worms there, but up north they were wiped out.
Wow. So interesting. So interesting.
Yeah. So the one thing to get an assessment of the biological component, we're going back to that. Um, those tests are really expensive to have done in your garden. So I came across at the state fair, the New York State Fair, the conservation department had an exhibit set up on how to test your soil for the home gardener. And they had this wonderful sign called Soil Your Underwear. Well, that caught everybody's eye. And this
No
is a
one's
fun,
forgetting that.
not at all. So, this was recommended by the USDA Conservation Service, and cooperative extensions all across the country are recommending it now. And it's easy, it's fun, and it gives you good information. So what you need to do is you need to start with a pair of tighty whities, 100% cotton underwear in May or June when the ground is warm enough that it's coming back to life. And what you're going to do is insert a shovel in your garden straight down, and you're going to move it back and forth to create an opening. And very carefully, you're going to insert the tighty whitey without it being bunched. Try and have it nice and flat. And you're going to leave the elastic waistband just above soil level so you know where this underwear is in your garden. And then you'll press the soil down so it's in good contact with the underwear. You'll water it and you'll walk away and just wait about 2 months or so. And in 2 months, you're going to dig up the underwear and you could hang them up on the clothesline. You could do this in several parts of your garden. And yes, the neighbors might talk about your laundry, but you will know if you have a biologically active soil, there won't be much underwear left. And what's left will be dark brown and falling apart. And if you don't have enough live creatures in your soil, your underwear will be more and more intact.
Now, so how long did you say to leave it there? I want to be sure I caught this.
2 months.
2 months. Oh my goodness.
So if you put it in May, end of July, you do it June, end of August, and it'll let you know right away how alive is your soil.
This is fantastic. This is fantastic.
If you Google it, just look at Soil Your Underwear. There are some wonderful photographs showing underwear that was buried in various types of soil. So you'll get a sense of what the underwear could look like.
Oh my goodness. This is just too fun.
Yeah. So we could start talking about, now that we know all this, how does this impact rose culture or just gardening?
Mhm.
Well, when we go to dig a hole, a lot of folks are putting all kinds of things in the bottom of the hole, thinking they're going to help the plant. It's been traditional in old-time rose gardeners to put a handful of Epsom salts in. And other folks will say a shovelful of manure. Other folks will say a shovelful of compost. Some will say a handful of 10-10-10. But you shouldn't put anything in the hole unless you know what your soil needs. That's number one. The next thing is when you're planting the hole, they always talked about digging this huge hole. Well, if you dig a huge hole and you put all that wonderful soil in it, what happens is the roots of your tree or your rose or your perennial will want to stay just in that hole where the good soil is. So I only make my hole a little broader than the root ball of the rose that's in a pot, or a little broader than the bare root rose. And I use almost only native soil in backfilling that. Now, to encourage the roots to spread out, what I'll do is I'll make furrows going out from that center hole, kind of like the arms of an octopus. And if I'm going to do any amendment in that hole, I'll mix it in those pathways as well. And then I fill those back in. So when the roots start to grow, instead of just hitting a hard edge where it's soft, broken up soil that's maybe amended, and then the native soil, they find that there's pathways where the roots can grow out. And what they're finding is in planting trees, that trees will do so much better when you do that. So don't make the hole too big. Provide arms going out in all directions, 360 degrees, pathways for roots to grow. Mulching. I try not to go too deep with my mulch. In my vegetable garden, I used to pile it on really deep. And now I just go a few inches of mulch. If I'm mulching, and by mulch I mean plant residue, wood chips, straw, things like that. If I'm adding compost, I never put more than about a half inch or an inch. That's really all you need. It's kind of like you're inoculating that top layer. And then on top of that, I can put my raw organic matter. Folks used to say when I'd mulch with wood chips, well, aren't you going to end up with nitrogen deficiency? And I say, well, in a forest, do the trees suffer from nitrogen deficiency because there's leaves that are piling up there? Well, no, because we've got a natural layer of compost in between, and it doesn't have to be that big, just so that we've got that biological component, and then it will break down that raw organic matter sitting on top.
Win-win on that one.
Exactly. The other thing is I try not to have the organic matter come right up to the base of the plant. I leave some space around it. And you'll see, unfortunately, these days when landscape companies come in and they plant trees or they're taking care of them, they do what I call volcano mulching. It's like they pile up a volcano of mulch around the base of a tree. And I see folks do that with roses as well. You need some space around the base so that we're not suffocating that plant.
For several years, we heard a lot about adding mycorrhizae when you planted your rose. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Mycorrhizae are really important, but you're going to find them in the compost that you've got. So they found a way to make money telling everybody you need mycorrhizae. Well, the mycorrhizae are present in the soil. They're present in the air. And the other thing is mycorrhizae is not just one thing. There are mycorrhizae that are specific for pine trees and others specific for roses. They're essential, but if you put the right ingredients in the ground, the mycorrhizae will take advantage of it and grow. I've been doing bonsai now for, probably 40 some years. And mycorrhizae became a big thing in the bonsai world. But what I noticed, even before it became popular, if I had a good bonsai potting mix, when I would take, say, a pine tree out after 2 years, the entire root ball would be covered in white mycorrhizae. I never put it in there.
Wow.
But it's airborne, it's soil-borne. If you want to do that, fine, but I think it's more complicated than they make it out to be. They're not selling mycorrhizae specific for a rose. So I don't think you need to worry about that. Just have the good live ingredients in there.
You said you used a good potting soil, and I know our listeners are going to want to know, well, what does he consider a good potting soil?
Well, bonsai would be a whole separate story. So let's just talk about potting up a bare root rose. If you wanted to pot it up like I do in my nursery before I put it in the ground, I sell all my plants as well-established roses in a 2 to 3 gallon pot. Standard practice in the trade has always been to use sphagnum peat and perlite mix. Well, one of the problems with that is sphagnum peat is one of those non-renewable or very, very slowly renewable resources. And we don't want to use all that up. And the other thing is, it's hard to get it wet unless you add a wetting agent. And if you do that sometimes, it stays wet too long. And the perlite, when we think about particle size, the particles are bigger than the sphagnum peat. And I'm sure you might have seen this when you bought those kind of potting mixes for containers that have sphagnum and perlite. And what floats to the top within a couple days of watering? All the perlite. Those larger light particles float up to the top and they look ugly as hell.
I hate them.
Yep. So what I've switched to, because I end up going through actually a ton of potting mix every year that my nursery is open. So I use a mix that is over 50% composted bark. I don't need to add mycorrhizae to that, do I? It's already in there. I've got the biological component. With a compost like that, it hasn't been sifted or sieved, so I have a range of particle sizes. And then the other 50% is made up of the sphagnum peat and the perlite. But in that mix, the perlite doesn't wash up to the surface because we've got larger particles with that composted bark. And the perlite then helps with the aeration in the soil mix itself within the pot. So I would look for a composted bark mix to go with sphagnum peat and perlite. And if you can't find that, then look for a good compost and go with a mix of compost and traditional pro mix, the sphagnum perlite mix.
Thank you for that. Well,
The
this
other,
has been so fantastic. I have just learned a ton.
could I just mention one more thing that hit me? A while back, I had a year that was really hot and my plants were getting chlorotic in the pot. And I was wondering what was going on because my potting mix, when I tested it at the beginning of the season, was within 5.5 and 6.5. And I called a friend over and he said, let's test your water. Well, my water was 8.2. Most municipalities now are buffering their water. The reason they're doing that is they want to minimize rusting in the water, and they'll put in this buffering agent, this calcium carbonate, in the water system because it then coats the inside of the pipes. And what was happening is I was raising the pH of my soil inadvertently.
Oh my goodness. Makes me want to get another soil test.
So you can get litmus paper, but I'd suggest folks test their water as well as their soil.
What a good point. because we don't know. We just don't know. You know, we use our water too. So we used to have a well, and we don't anymore. So we're using water that's, you know, things have been done to it for sure. So it'd be
Hmm.
good to get a test for sure.
The other thing that's happened when folks use rainwater is back when I was a kid and there was acid rain because of all the pollution we were putting in the air, there wasn't as much black spot on a lot of the roses because the fungus of black spot couldn't live with acid rain. But now that we've eliminated the acid rain and it's more neutral, and we're dealing with municipalities that are buffering the water, some of the black spot is growing.
You know, balance in all things, isn't it the truth? I mean, you know, you change one thing, and if you go too far, you've changed so many things that you didn't intend to change.
Yes, ma'am.
My goodness. We're getting close on our time. This has been fabulous. So in our final minutes, is there anything that we haven't covered that is important to our topic today?
Um, I think the key thing is test, test, test.
And you gave us
And
some fun tests that we can do, actually.
we know what everybody's going to remember.
Oh my goodness. Well, there's a lot here to remember, and I'm just so grateful for all the information that you've given us. But let's talk roses just for 1 minute. So
Sure.
I'm curious, as a nursery owner, are you seeing an increase in interest in roses? Because I'm hearing that people are. And in general, is there a certain kind of rose that you're getting asked about more?
Well, as soon as COVID hit, the garden bug skyrocketed. Nursery sales went through the roof. I had one of my best sales year the first and second year of COVID. So the one thing that I noticed was that we were getting more younger folks, and they were very interested in non-chemical, non-spray approaches to growing roses. They wanted things that were disease resistant. They wanted things that were vigorous and fragrance. People are remembering fragrance. They're loving that. So that's what I've seen that folks want. And for years, I always had trouble selling single or semi-double roses. People like that hybrid tea form, but they're starting to realize that a semi-double or a single rose is what I call pollinator friendly. And if you want to have more pollinators, bees in your garden, the singles and semi-doubles are the way to go. And I'm seeing more interest in those.
Oh, that's so true. Now, let's say we have new rose growers. What are two that you would recommend?
Uh, Anything hybridized by the Cordes family. It's a German nursery company that is now in its fifth generation. They started right after World War One, and they've been the worldwide leaders in disease-resistant vigorous roses. So in looking to buy a rose, if you're not sure about who hybridized it, all roses have a registration name, and it's usually 3 capital letters followed by some smaller lowercase letters. So look for a rose on the label with a KOR in capital letters as the registration name, and it means it's by Cordis. They've got really strict testing, um, and they select for the very best. They're not just looking for the fanciest color this year. They're looking for something that will endure.
I would totally agree. Many of my roses are Cordes roses because they do so well. They just do so well. And I hear this from loads and loads of people here in our region. They're standouts for sure. That's a good one. Now, one more thing I want to talk about before I let you go, and is that you have a upcoming speaking engagement that I want you to tell everybody about.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. The Heritage Rose Foundation tries to do at least an annual conference, and this year it's going to be in New York City. It'll be Friday, Saturday, Sunday, June 6th, 7th, and 8th. And on the 6th, they're going to be meeting at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and I'll be one of the speakers there. And my topic is going to be romancing the ramblers. I've always loved ramblers. The first rose I ever grew was a rambler, and I'm spending more time going back to them now. And in fact, I'm part of a program through the American Rose Society called Save the Ramblers. And I believe you did a podcast on that, right?
We sure did. We sure did.
So that'll be the focus of my talk. Friday will be at Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and Saturday and Sunday they'll be visiting various rose gardens throughout the metropolitan area.
Now, friends, if you'd like more information on the conference, you can go to heritagerosefoundation.org, and right there on the homepage is information for a one-day ticket or to stay for the entire conference, including tours. And I know they're going to be at different gardens, but they're also going to be in what's the district?
The Historic Rose District in
Yes. Oh my goodness, it's so, my
West.
daughter and I visited a few years ago, and it's just so rich with history. It's just wonderful.
I'll be donating a couple roses to their silent auction, some vintage ramblers. So if you're interested in those, it would be a great way to get started.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you. I can't thank you enough, Leon, for joining me today. It's always a pleasure, and today it was a total education.
Well, thanks so much. I always have a good time talking with you.
Oh, so wonderful to have you. And friends, thank you for joining us today. I hope you learned tons as well. There's so many good tips that he gave us. Aren't we lucky? Now, also, I have one more copy of the book, How to Eat a Rose, that I mentioned on the recent podcast about herbal properties of roses. The other books are going out this week, so if you want that last copy of the little book of rose recipes and stories, send me an email at rosechatpodcast@gmail.com by March the 10th. And also, if you're interested in knowing more about some of the roses that Leon was just talking about, his love for ramblers, and they are amazing. I love them too. You can check out a previous podcast where Leon and I chatted about roses that ramble, and you can search that out at rosechatpodcast.com.
You've been listening to the Rose Chat Podcast with Chris VanCleave and Teresa Byington, expert rose gardeners who want to help you achieve the rose garden of your dreams. Don't miss an episode. Listen anytime on our website at rosechatpodcast.com or listen on the go via the Rose Chat app on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. Share this podcast with your social networks and join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by using the hashtag RoseChat. Join us next time for another edition of the Rose Chat Podcast. The Rose Chat Podcast is a production of the Rose Chat Media Group, Birmingham, Alabama.